We are now on 71 stations across the United States, which, considering we've only been at it for 5 years, is pretty good growth from starting with one in New York City. We're also on 2 television stations, public whoops, something went off. Public radio, public television in Manhattan, New York, and here in the Bay Area on station KSCM. I believe that's the name of a TV station here. They now broadcast us as a kind of, I'm like Rush Limbaugh. That is, it's a television program showing me doing my radio program. Other than that, the resemblance doesn't go very far. He likes capitalism. You may have heard that. He's very enthusiastic about it. And as you know, if you listen to my program, I am not. I don't like the system. I really never have. I suspect most of you have your issues with this system, and I want to encourage you in every possible way to take a step back and look at it. And so that's what I'm going to do with you today. This morning, some of you heard Harriet Fraad talk about one consequence of capitalism, which is growing inequality and what that does, particularly to personal lives and personal relationships. I'm not going to talk about inequality except for one opening statistic that I came across that I thought dramatized. I'm going to talk about a different problem of capitalism, not the problem of inequality, but the problem of instability. The fact that the system is highly irrational, erratic, and up and down in its nature, and that it's going to bite you in your personal life sooner or later, and probably sooner, and I'll explain what I mean. Here's, though, the one statistic that I came across. There's a place you can go. Some of you may have heard me mention this on the radio this last week. There's a place you can go on the internet called billionairecensus.com. And the job of this place on the internet is to keep track of the world's billionaires. And if you went there, and I encourage you to go there, it's not a left-wing internet site, it's much the other way, you would learn that the world today has just under 2,500 billionaires, 2,500 of them. And that if you added them up, their wealth, it would be, if they all lived in one place, imagine that, if they all lived in one country, then that would be the 3rd richest country in the world after the United States and the People's Republic of China, who rank 1 and 2 by wealth. This would be the 3rd wealthiest country in terms of its asset. It would also be the world's smallest country because 2,500 people, as you can imagine, would make a small country, but they would talk loudly with their wealth. How much wealth do they have? $7.7 trillion worth of wealth. If you were to take half the wealth of each of these folks, these 2,500 people, they would still rank among the richest people on the planet, but you would suddenly have almost $4 trillion with which to deal with the problems of the world, which is hundreds, if not thousands of times more money than the total amount of foreign aid, UN assistance, and everything else currently being done. This situation, that there are 2,500 billionaires presiding over wealth that is therefore not available to solve the problems of the world, is one of the great achievements of modern capitalism. And if for no other reason, you should be a fervent supporter of any system that puts that much wealth into such few hands. And when you add that such billionaires include Donald Trump, Well, we're not sure exactly how many billions he has, and he's a little fuzzy on it himself, but I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. And many others like him. Then not only is this system capable of concentrating wealth, but it concentrates it in some of the most capable hands into which it could be concentrated. But as I said, I'm not here to talk about the achievement of capitalism in producing inequality on a scale you would have to go to ancient Egypt to equal. Pharaohs, remember the story, the pyramids and all of that. I want to talk about instability. The word for instability, by the way, you don't hear that much in economics because it's embarrassing to the profession that defends and endorses capitalism to speak of it as unstable. Imagine if you heard someone refer to one of your best friends as unstable, you'd pick up the negative tone of the word. So we don't call capitalism unstable, even though, as I'll explain to you in a moment, it surely is and always has been. So we use other phrases like capitalism's cyclical quality. Cyclical quality. That's like calling the bus driver a transportation engineer. Makes him feel better, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything. On the left, there's been a kind of sloppy language in which this problem of instability has been mostly termed as capitalism tending to crisis. It's in a crisis. It's a crisis-ridden system, language like that. And it's that I want to go into with you. So let's begin. Ups and downs, which is really what we're talking about, ups and downs of capitalism are as old as this system. It's very important for all of us to understand that built into the capitalist system is a crisis tendency, a tendency for things to go wrong. But it's very particular things. Here's what they are. Suddenly, huge numbers of people are thrown out of work. They're not thrown out of work because of anything they're doing wrong on the job. They're not thrown out of work because they're not working hard. They're not thrown out of work because what they do is unuseful or irrelevant. In fact, there's no reason they're thrown out of work other than the cyclical nature of the economy, which periodically throws millions in the United States out of work. For example, in 2008, the economy tanked and millions of people were thrown out of work. And this happens all the time. And at the same time that people are thrown out of work, large numbers of businesses collapse. They go bankrupt. They stop functioning. They close their doors. Banks, shops, factories close in huge numbers, suddenly. Typically happens over a few months' time. Boom. Actually, it's not called a boom. It's called a bust. It's a more appropriate kind of word. And then, after a while, and I'm going to get to it in a minute with you what that while is, things kind of come back. You know the language from today's newspapers. There's a bit of a recovery. And then the thing seems to go for a while, and then boom, or rather bust, it goes down. This up and down quality, that's what I mean by instability. It can be devastating to individuals caught up in it. You're going along with a job, you're earning an income, you're entering into relationships with other people, you're borrowing money perhaps that you have to pay back, you're thinking of getting a loan to get your kid through college, and then you lose your job, and you can't make those payments, you can't keep up those relationships. It can be devastating, and usually is, for large numbers of people. How long has capitalism displayed this kind of cyclical boom-bust quality? Answer, for as long as it's existed. It has never solved this problem. It has tried to, but it always had. And how often do they happen? Every 4 to 7 years. Like clockwork. At the end of my talk today, I'll tell you a little bit about how in New York City at Wall Street, there's great agitation now because since crises come every 4 to 7 years, and the last downturn severely was 2009, do the advanced math, we're due for one. We're due for one, and there's great anxiety. For those of you who follow the stock market, you might have noticed the last week or two have been very volatile, up drastically, down. That's the anxiety of the people who do this for a living, that we're in a doozy and you don't want to be owning stocks if the market is going to go down because we're due for a crisis. So instability is built into capitalism. It always has been. Always has been. And there's been no end of effort for the 300 years that this system has been the dominant one in the world. There's been no end of effort to try to solve the problem, to overcome the instability. And all of those efforts to date are a colossal, unmitigated failure. The last horrible one was the 1930s. The economy went down, don't get scared now, in October of 1929. It really collapsed. By 1933, 4 years into it, the unemployment rate in the United States was 25%. That's 5 times what it is now. The collapse of the 1930s lasted from 1929 to 1941. That's a long time. It produced unspeakable suffering. Some of you may remember books like, I don't know, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath or of Mice and Men. And a lot of literature came out of what life was like in those years. A lot of families were traumatized by that event, never recovered. So this was really catastrophic. And so the entire economics profession and the entire governments of the Western world tried to figure out how to make things different in capitalism so it wouldn't be so unstable. And they developed monetary policies and fiscal policies and government and they assured us in the 1950s and 60s that they had done it. They had figured out how to make a capitalism that wouldn't be unstable. And wouldn't you know it, they failed. That's why we had a big doozy in 2008. In fact, the second worst one after the 1930s, although we shouldn't be quite yet ready to celebrate that it was only the second worst, since we're not out of it yet, and it may still surprise us, especially if we have that downturn that they're so worried about right now. Turns out there's an agency in the United States that keeps track of the ups and downs for any of you that are interested. It's called the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. You can go find it on the internet too. According to them, we had downturns in the United States between the end of the Great Depression, 1941, and the beginning of the thing we're in now, 2008. Between them, 11 others. And when you figure it out, it's 4 to 7 years, like clockwork. Okay, now why is this system unstable? And by the way, were feudalism and slavery, did those systems have instabilities? Yes, but they tended to be more having to do with war that would destabilize these societies, and with nature. Too much rain, too little rain, too much cold, too little, that would destabilize. But built in a mechanism that gave them trouble every 4 to 7 years, no matter what the climate was, no matter what the warfare was, that's a unique achievement of capitalism, and one more reason to be a sworn supporter of a system with that kind of instability. I hope when I'm done that your reaction the next time says why you are a critic of capitalism is to scratch your head, look at the person speaking to you and say, how could you be anything else? given the way the system works. It's unstable, and there has not been any discovery, solution, mechanism, rule, regulation, law, agency that has been able to prevent it. That's really important. Next, let's turn a little bit theoretical, explain what is happening here, why it happens, and what goes on. The first part of the explanation is that capitalism as a system is deeply committed to its organizational life, in which thousands, or in this country, millions of enterprises, each makes a decision by itself. Are we going to grow? Are we going to hire more people, buy more inputs, produce more stuff? Or this year not do that, wait until next year? Should we go into producing this or that? Should we compete with this company or maybe that? All of these decisions are made by themselves, by each little company. This has the result of looking like a big intersection into which everybody comes with their car and decides whether to make a left turn or a right turn whenever they think it's appropriate. And discover that when you do that, you crash into everybody. In economics, it works like this. If a lot of companies decide that it isn't a good time to expand right now, we're going to hunker down. We think that the economy doesn't look so good, so we're going to lay off workers because there's no point in keeping the workers we have employed here working to produce stuff we don't think we'll be able to sell. Because you hire a worker now, but you don't have the stuff that worker helps to produce for months or years into the future. So you got to make an educated guess about whether you want to lay out the money to hire somebody now. And it's very dangerous in capitalism, because if you lay out the money now to hire a lot of workers and they produce a lot of stuff and you can't sell it 2 years from now, you're dead. You go bankrupt. Instead of handing out charity, you've got your hand out for it. So the punishment for a capitalist who makes a bad mistake is very scary. So you can see why capitalists will periodically decide, whoa, this is not a good time. Maybe there's a capitalist in this room listening to me who tomorrow is going to say, whoa, I got scared. Or I read something in the Wall Street Journal, or I heard something on the TV or the radio, and or I heard something from my workers, or I read something about the competitors I face. So each capitalist decides, and if a whole bunch of capitalists decide to slow down, here's what they do. They cancel orders to their suppliers. No need to have all that stuff come to the factory. I just laid off 10% of my workers. So they call up the supplier and say, hey, ship me 10% less inputs. The capitalist goes, oh my God, I hired tons of people last year to produce more, and the people I depend on. You understand? Every decision is made individually. Each capitalist telling himself or herself, I'm a smarty. I know what I'm doing, and I won't make a mistake. But unfortunately, this isn't about your mistake. It's like driving a car. You're just as dead if the mistake is by the other person. Capitalism, Marx once said, is the anarchy of production. And the point is, capitalism, priding itself on each individual businessman or woman making their own decision, is, to use a technical term, stupid. It is a stupid way to organize an economy. It may flatter the individual, just like we can have John Wayne coming into the intersection in his wonderful Hummer. But if he makes left and right turns whenever he feels like it because he's such a smart guy, we're all in danger. That's why we have traffic lights. That's why we have rules. You know what those are? Those are the efforts of a collectivity, the community, to govern each individual's behavior so it doesn't add up to mass chaos and killing. But we don't do that in economics. And we think we're smart. for not doing it. And the result is we have periodic collapses when the different decisions made by the different capitalists don't work out. Why should they? So what happens is, for example, too much is produced. The capitalists, each one making their own decision, produce an output that simply is more than people can afford to buy. This has got a name. This is called overproduction. Or if you like, underconsumption. These are two different ways of saying the same thing. The system produces more. Let me give you an example from right now. The capacity to produce automobiles in the world right now is 2 to 3 times larger than the number of automobiles the people of this planet can now afford to buy. This is a very large problem. This means capitalist enterprises have borrowed billions of dollars to develop the factories, to hire the workers, to buy the machines, to produce stuff they cannot profitably sell. It's a terrible problem. And right now, every major automobile company in the world is desperately trying to figure out how to cope with this problem. One of the results is Detroit is a wasteland. That's one result of this problem. Another problem, that we are destroying a large part of Mexico to make it a place of cheap production of automobiles. Mexico, thinking it's doing real great by having people come down there, doesn't understand or doesn't want to face the fact that what's being built in Mexico is the capacity to produce cars for which there's no demand in the world. And that's going to be a very big problem for a Mexico which cannot afford such problems. But they're in such desperate shape that if you come there to produce anything for the moment, they will welcome you with open arms. This is a system that is, guess what? Poorly organized. It presents itself as the paragon of efficiency, but it isn't. You know, what you can go to is a factory or an office, and you can see a very efficient operation, but the efficiency is at the micro level. It's at the level of the individual enterprise. But when you put it all together, it's the efficient production of a system that is out of control on the macro level. What good is it that each car entering this crazy intersection is equipped with automatic brakes and sensors and all? If they're making decisions left or right on their own, we're going to have crashes. Capitalism has become more and more efficient at the level of producing inside the enterprise, but hasn't made one whit of gain on how to cope with the chaos of the larger economy as a whole. So things go down. Every so often they produce too much. Let's take a little closer look at some of the ways capitalism shoots itself in the foot. And who pays the price? The good news is I can explain to you what the mechanisms are. The bad news is you already know who pays the price. It's the person you see in the mirror. And that's what you have to face. So let's look at some of the mechanisms. Every capitalist in the world is always trying, in the nature of this system, and you all know this already, is always trying to save on labor costs. That's the way they talk about it. That is, they try to find a cheaper way of producing whatever they produce. You know that. It's called automation. You get a machine that replaces a worker. Or maybe you get a cheaper worker to replace a more expensive worker. You substitute a woman for a man, an immigrant for a native worker, etc. You know all the mechanisms. You live in every day. So every capitalist prides himself or herself on saving labor costs. You know, many capitalists have left the United States. That's a big issue in Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton's debates. They've left the United States to go to China or India or Brazil to get the cheaper labor there, to save on labor. So a lot of the world is about capitalists saving on labor costs. Okay, let's follow this through. Why do capitalists do it? Because, very simple, more profits for them. If they can get the stuff done and pay workers less than they paid them before, that's more money for them to keep when they sell the output. Very simple here. You do not need a PhD in economics to understand this. In fact, I'm here to tell you that if you get a PhD in economics, you will be more confused than you were before you went. So it's sad but true. Tells you something about higher education, why they would even have to call something higher education, given that it must imply that something else is lower education, and we sure don't want that. So let's pursue this here. You're successful, you capitalists. You've saved on labor costs. You've substituted a machine for this worker. You've substituted a cheap, desperate immigrant for a local person. You've gone to some far corner of the world where you can get away with paying people less. You've done it. And what's the result? The people, the mass of people earning money have gotten less because you've succeeded in screwing them out of a wage. Because you bought a machine, or because you went abroad, or because you hired a cheaper labor. You've saved on labor, thereby reducing the amount of income of the mass of people to whom you have to sell what you produce. Oh my goodness. What you've done in your own advantage by lowering what you pay to the worker comes back and bites you by having insufficient customers to buy your stuff. Gee. You can't win for losing here. What kind of system is this that encourages the capitalist to save on the labor cost only to discover that that's the worst thing he can do? So what can he do? Raise the wages, but then he'll have no profit. He can't do that. What is he going to do? He has no idea. He does what he does and hopes somehow it'll work out. And for a while it does, and then it doesn't, and then there's too much stuff, and you can't sell it, and you cry. And you vote for some weird politician who tells you a crazy story about how he's going to fix all of this by making you great again. And given how you feel, this is comforting. But neither such a politician nor any amount of suffering you go through solves this problem. It just sits there. In order for the problem to be solved, of course, you'd have to have, let's see now, a mechanism that coordinated what everybody's producing together with the incomes they earn from producing it, so there's enough income for them to buy what they have collectively produced. This is not rocket science. This is, we do know what it is. It's called economic planning. You'd have to have a way to say, you produce this much, but not more, because there isn't need for that. So stop at this point, and we'll have more of that produced, and we'll make sure people have an income so they can buy. We'd have to work it all out, and the decision would have to be collective, coordinated, rather than this chaotic. It's simply doing for the economy what traffic control does for the intersection. Lights, signs, rules, and 3 or 4 highway patrolmen to help convince you to follow them. We don't do that in economics. We call economic planning evil. It's the government telling us what to do. The same idiot who wants to be able to go into the intersection doing whatever occurs to him or her at the moment, that's the capitalist who doesn't want the government to come in and tell me. It's not some abstraction. The point of governmental planning, or of planning by any entity, is to overcome the inherent anarchic quality of capitalists making decisions by themselves. That's why the socialist movement for 150 years has been in favor of planning. It's an elemental understanding of what capitalism does to itself, by itself. We don't have downturns every 4 to 7 years because of the Soviet Union, or China, or Cuba, or any outside force. To blame the economic downturns on the government, given how little the government can do about most of these things, is a peculiar argument loved only by people who are unable to imagine a positive role for the government. They have a name in our culture. They're called libertarians. They want liberty from the government. Okay, I get that. That's good. But if liberty means there's no coordination, then your liberty is going to convulse you with periodic downturns, and that's maybe the price you want to pay for giving the government no role in coordinating the economy. That's a remarkable position to hold, given the catastrophic effects of economic downturns on this society over and over again, and especially now. All right, let me give you another theoretical example. By the way, these are theories of the contradictoriness of capitalism. That's how they're handled in the literature. This absurdity that every capitalist tries to save on labor costs only to discover that he's just eradicated his own market. The craziness of this system. Well, here's another one. This one has to do with another problem capitalists have. Most capitalists are in the business of producing a commodity, a good or a service that they hire workers to produce. They provide the tools and equipment, and the workers work with them, and they produce an output which the capitalist owns and sells. And the capitalist sells that product for more money than it costs to pay the workers or buy the materials, and the difference is the profit the capitalist keeps for himself. So far, I think we're all on the same page. Now, it turns out that the capitalist, in all advanced capitalist countries, has to solve a couple of problems that are troubling. It turns out the capitalist realizes this very early on, or else he disappears. When he's done with the production process, say producing chairs, so pick chairs, why not? He's got on his hands a lot of chairs. That's not what he wants. He actually has no interest in chairs at all. He doesn't even use them in his own house. He sits on the floor. The only reason this capitalist is interested in the chairs is because he wants to sell them, which indeed he has to do to recoup the money, without which he can't continue to be a capitalist, because he needs money to hire the workers for the next week or month and to buy more inputs like wood and glue and the other things that make chairs. So every capitalist has got a problem. He's got to convert the end product of production, objects, goods and services, into money. Now, how does the capitalist do that? Well, there are two choices. The first choice, which capitalists have always done, and still do to some degree, is that he has to hire people who become salesmen and saleswomen. You all know about this. Some of you are that. You don't make anything. You don't produce any value. Your job isn't about producing anything. Your job is to convert value in the form of a commodity into value in the form of money. You're just a changer. There's a word for that in economics. You are a merchant. You convert output in physical form into money. The capitalist has to get this done, otherwise he dies as a capitalist. So the poor capitalist is very pissed about this, if he understands it. He has to take a part of the profit he gets from the workers who make stuff and use it to pay the people whose job it is to convert those things from physical to money, the merchant. Here in the United States, This has led merchants to say, hey, this is exciting. Can I figure out a way, these merchants have said to themselves, can I figure out a way to make that capitalist who hires the workers to produce things like chairs dependent on me because he can't survive if he doesn't convert the chair into money? Can I make him dependent on me so much that I can take all of his profits? He might as well give them to me to convert the goods into money because he's dead if he doesn't. So can I do that? And the answer is yes, I can. And you all know the name of the merchant who figured that out in this country. His name is Walmart. Now watch. An obscure, I don't mean to be, if anyone here is from Arkansas, let me say two things. I understand your predicament and my condolences. Okay? But, here was one of your fellow Arkansans, or whatever you say, down there in Bentonville, a town all of us have visited many times, who figured this out. And he went to capitalists all over the world. And he said, look, you got a bunch of people here, your salesmen, who go around selling your chairs. How much of your profit do you have to spend to have them do this work that produces nothing, that just converts the chair from chair to money? He said, well, I'm spending millions a year. We'll take it off your hands. We will have a truck at the back of your factory, takes every chair as it comes off. You won't fire all of your salespeople. You don't have to pay them. You just pay us. We'll take care of everything for you. And we'll create stores all across America where people can come and buy everything there is that they could imagine, and a lot of things they have never imagined. And everybody does it because it's a great deal. And as soon as Walmart's got you, they announce that the fee to get them to come to your place has gone up. And what are you going to do? By that time, you fired your sales staff. They've all gotten other jobs. You're Walmart's prisoner. And Walmart is going to get more and more out of you. Jeez. This could destroy a capitalist economy as one player, the merchants, concentrate into their hands a level of wealth that cripples all the others. Walmart is now the #1 private employer in the United States, the largest corporation in this country. A merchant who started off as nothing at all in Bentonville, Arkansas. How's capitalism working for him? Real well. He made a list of the 20 richest people in the United States. Half of them are members of the Wolff family. Into their hands. Is this good for lots of capitalists? No, it's a disaster for them. You know who's played the same game? Another group of people who don't produce anything. They are called financiers, bankers. Here's what they do. They don't produce anything. They give you a bunch of money on condition that you give it back to them in a year with a little extra. Doesn't produce anything. But every capitalist has become dependent on them. Has to get credit. Has to get money when they need it and they don't have their own. They go to the financier. He says, fine, here it is. You got to give it back to me at the end of the year. And if you have trouble, well, we can negotiate. And you're going to have to give me more because you're a problem. You have a bad credit risk. Does this all work out? No. Of course it doesn't work out because Walmart may take so much profit that they become very rich, but the producers of the country are hobbled because they're all dependent on a few stores. Otherwise, they can't reach their market. They can't sell anything unless they sell it through Walmart. They can't function unless they're giving interest to the banks because you have to pay off your interest if you're ever going to go to the bank again. They can't. They're hobbled. Can this bring the system down? You bet it can. Can it produce an economic downturn? Yes. One in which lots of producers lay off their workers, but the people in finance or retail are doing fine. Can the system stand this? I don't know. This is crazy arrangement. But we're not done. Here's the way it all comes together. Starting in the 1970s, in the United States, the economy changed in ways you can now understand. The capitalists were powerful enough to roll back that annoying New Deal stuff that came out of the Great Depression. The benefits, the laws, all of that. And they were able to bring a whole new wave of immigrants in the United States, from Latin America particularly. And they were able to take advantage of a new technology, the computer, to wipe out millions of jobs. You put all those things together, they had a chance to do something which you now know all capitalists are always looking to do: save on labor costs. You could replace a worker with a computer, you could replace a Native American worker with a new immigrant, and you could leave the country and go someplace else and save money on labor that way. So they did. They laid people off, they fired people off, they automated jobs, they hired immigrants, they did it all. And then they discovered, just like you now understand, that now nobody can buy anything. And then a brilliant capitalist came along and said, no, I got a solution. Whenever you hear a capitalist say, I got a solution, hold on to your wallet. Because somebody's going to be reaching in there and taking it from you. Here's a brilliant capitalist. You know what we're going to do? We're going to solve the problem of workers not having enough to buy by giving them credit. We never did that before. If we gave workers any credit before, it was only when there was security on their house. We'll give you enough money to buy a house, but if you don't pay us back, we take your house. That's called a mortgage. But in the 1970s, it changed. We're going to give you credit with no security. Man, if a capitalist offers you a deal that's unbelievable, don't believe it. But you all did believe it. It's called a credit card. And a little bit later, it's called a student loan. Money given to you which solved a problem capitalism had. You couldn't afford to buy this stuff because the wages had gone nowhere. The wages were cut. But it didn't matter. You could use borrowed money. So goods were bought and sold because people were using the credit. And that would continue so long as they could pay off the credit, which in 2008 they couldn't do anymore. And then it all collapsed. This brilliant capitalist system. Kaplooey. Millions laid off, the same underlying instability forcing itself up because all you'd had is one slapdash adjustment to coping after another. And after 2 or 3 shots, you delayed it for a while, but the price of delaying it was worse when it hit, like a disease. Don't see the doctor, and then by the time you go, it's too late. Capitalism is a fundamentally unstable system. It has these downturns periodically, wipes millions of people out, destroys businesses. And by the way, how does it come back? Let me bring this to a close by driving that point. How does it come back? The answer is not all that hand-waving you see, whether it's President Bush or President Obama, or it's a stimulus program, or it's quantitative easing, or any of the other junk you see in the newspaper, which has the same relevance to what's going on as the election campaign has to the political reality of our society. It's a spectacle. You are there to giggle or to throw things, but you're not. It's not serious. Why not? Because the resolution of all crises is the same. As masses of people are laid off, they're fired. Take, for example, the period from the summer of 2008 until the summer of 2009. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. They didn't suddenly become inefficient. They didn't suddenly become incapable. Had nothing to do with that. It was a capitalist downturn. thing hadn't been coordinated. There were too much being produced. It couldn't be bought anymore. The people who had been buying on credit had run out of credit. That's what the subprime mortgage meant. They couldn't pay their debts. So the system crashed yet again. And what begins to happen in this society is truly phenomenal. There's a kind of mass sense of disaster. And in a mass sense of disaster, what is wanted is, if not the reality of someone finding a solution, at least the theater of it all. And that's what Bush does. I am going to stimulate, and I'm going to, he stimulates, and he goes out. In comes stimulator number 2, Mr. Obama. He stimulates the economy. Meanwhile, year after year goes by, and what's happening? The wages are going down in America. Why? Because that's how we solve capitalism's problems, like its economic instability. When workers lose their job, the first thing they do is if they're lucky, they go on unemployment. Many of you have done that. You get your check for a while. But if you don't find a job, as millions didn't, then you run out of your unemployment after a certain number of weeks. Well, then what do? Well, if you have some savings, you dip into those. If you have relatives who give a damn about you, you dip into them. If that doesn't work, you begin to steal your neighbor's car, things like that. Or hit them over the head with a frying pan when they're not noticing it, and so forth. You do what you can to survive. But pretty soon, your neighbor locks the car, looks at you in a funny way, keeps a distance, all of that, and you've run out. So you now have to do what all is left. You have to go back to the labor market and say, yeah, I was getting $32 an hour, but I'll work for 12. For those of you who don't know, over the last 9 years, millions and millions of Americans lost jobs that paid a good salary and are now working at Starbucks, which pays crap, or another place which pays less than crap. Wow, that means the whole cost of labor is going down. And you know what else happens? Tens of thousands of little businesses collapse. They have to sell, as part of their collapse, their desks, their furniture, their computers, their vehicles. The second-hand market of inputs for capitalists drop in price. Well, when the wages drop enough and the cost of equipment in the second-hand market drops enough, capitalists say, hey, at that low price of wage and at that cheap input, I can make money. And they go in and they build the economy up again. And it goes for 4 to 7 years, and it goes, that's the instability. That's how it gets resolved. That's how it's being resolved now. The rest of it, the stimulus program and easing, this is theater for all of you to take as, the government is really concerned here. If it were really concerned, it wouldn't allow the crazy individual decision-making by capitalists that gets us into this mess every year. But that's taboo. That can't be even discussed. If they were really upset about unemployment, the solution is very obvious. It was the solution we found in the 1930s. The government hires everybody who is not hired by private enterprise. End of conversation. There's no problem here. We did that in the 1930s. Roosevelt created public employment, hired 15 million people. End of story. That's how the Golden Gate Bridge got built, et cetera, et cetera. The benefits have lasted decades since. There's no problem in solving these things but the if is the impossible thing. You can't question capitalism. The only reason they did it in the 1930s is that you had, as Kip says all the time, you had a mass movement from below that was frightening the people at the top. Communists and socialists and unionists who were saying, hey, you better do something or else. That frightened them. Then they did stuff. But this is the same problem. Nothing was done here. The thing just solved itself. Meanwhile, families, millions of them, are wiped out as they have to cope with what it means to have a breadwinner who used to get $80,000 a year, now a breadwinner who's happy to get 18. The adjustments there are staggering in the relationship between husband and wife, parents and children, neighbors, friends, relatives. You know the drill. You figure it out. You're in it, or you're facing it. Crazy what this society does to itself. And what was learned from this craziness? The business, the people who sold the debt solution in the 1970s and 80s that gave you all credit cards, just remind you of the history. Before the 1970s, credit cards were only something given to a few businessmen and women traveling. American Express had the market, that was it. It was only in the 70s and 80s that everybody got into their wallet, the Visa card, the MasterCard, the stuff you all have. Mass credit with no security. Nothing like a house to back up a mortgage loan. Credit card, got nothing. That's why you pay high interest rates on credit cards. You know what the banks did who issued the credit? They said, this is fantastic. We're going to make money off of every American worker by charging them wild amounts of interest on these credits that we give them. It'll keep the economy going by selling stuff to people with loans. It'll keep the banks going by making huge interest on the loans. And then the banks, because this is capitalism, said, wait a minute. They hired some clever graduates of business schools, masters, MBA. MBA sounds like an athletic association, but it isn't. It's the business. And they said, you know, there's more money to be made. We can invent a new kind of security. Here's what it is. It isn't a share of a company that makes something. That's old capitalism. We got a new one. We're going to create a security that's actually a bundle of people's debts. And if you buy that security, you are providing the money which we, the bank, will then lend to consumers who have to pay it back with interest, and the flow of dividends to you as a shareholder will be a piece of those debt payments that the consumer makes. By the way, these are called asset-backed securities, ABS. For those of you interested in high finance, this is the most exciting thing in 30 years. It allowed the banks to go to rich people around the world, big corporations and rich people, and say, here's a new way to make money. Not just own pieces of companies that make something, but you can lend to the workers so they can buy, and therefore not bankrupt, the companies whose stock you own. Are you with me? You will now not only get the profit from the stock in the company you own, but you'll make an additional profit by lending to the poor schmuck whose wages aren't enough to buy anything anymore and who'll have to pay you interest. And the rich people said, damn good idea. And they did. They lent money to the banks who used it to lend to the masses, you, so you could all pay interest to them at the same time that you pay the exorbitant prices for the goods that they sell you. They get you twice, and you're grateful. I want to make it humorous, but who exactly are you laughing at? It's that person in the mirror who's paying. And then when it predictable happens, and what do I mean predictable? More and more debt of the American people from the 70s to 2008. But the wages on the basis of which you're ever going to pay those debts back isn't going anywhere. Well, they said, folks, that's only a matter of time. You can't keep borrowing on a flat income. So eventually in 2008, the predictable happened. We can't pay, whereupon the whole house of financial cards collapses. You live in a system that works this way, and it always has. Your future, that of your neighborhood. You invested in an apartment, the neighborhood that you invested in, its well-being, and therefore the value of your apartment depends on all of this. You can't give away houses in Detroit or Cleveland or Camden, New Jersey, or 100 other American cities. You cannot give them away. Secure investment? There is no such thing. You live in a system whose inequality, we began with that today, you heard about it this morning, and now whose instability are staggering in their implications. Why on earth would you accept this? Why do you live in this? Why do you accept this insecurity? Some of you have heard me say, because I like it and it seems to get a good rise out of my audiences, if you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Why do you live with this system? Why do you question people whose mentality says, we've got to change this system, not fix it, not another presidential candidate saying, I got to fix, we're going to do this, and we'll have this law, and this, stop. You've been there, we've done that, that's over. Nobody could be that stupid that many times. Not even us. System change is what has to happen because everything else has been tried. The one thing that neither Hillary nor Donald can begin to say is to dare to say, this is a systemic problem. We offer a systemic response. They can't admit the problem, therefore all they offer is warmed over versions of what has failed over and over again. Crisis is part of capitalism. Last point. Capitalists know this. That's why they have spent as much time and energy trying to develop solutions. They know they got a problem. The way they see this problem is every time the economy goes down, alarms go up. If you read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, oh my God, and the unemployment is going up, and people will, here's what they mean, they don't say it, people will begin to question the system because it's not performing. We got to fix this somehow. But the biggest thing they achieve by talking about quantitative easing and monetary policy and getting all excited about the latest things that Janet Yellen has said to the press in her press conference last Thursday, the real purpose of all of that is to deflect you away from the systemic recognition and the systemic question. And the academics come in and support it not only by giving you 400 arguments about why some old Keynesian idea will solve the problem this time, even though it never did in the past. The real purpose of the academics is to get you to believe that capitalism as a system is so strong, so deep, so well entrenched, so successful, and so global that the very idea of being a critic is somehow absurd. That this is, it's everywhere. It's so strong. It's so secure. If anything I can get across today, if there's anything I would be most excited to, it's to give you the idea, scary as it might be, that capitalism is very, very fragile. It is not a secure system. A secure system would not produce an inequality that threatens it every day. A secure system would not produce an instability like this. It makes this inequality that freaks people out and this instability that does because it can't help itself. You're looking at an entity that is going to tear us all apart because it can't figure out, or dare not, face its own limitations. What Walmart does is as destructive as any help it gives. What each capitalist does when he tries to save on labor may be good for his profit, but destabilizes the whole system. This is not a secure system. And if the mass of people capable of being critical, like you, believes that it's secure, that's the biggest help you can give it. Don't do that. Don't be complicit inadvertently in your own thinking with a notion of a secure, solid, certain thing that we can only buzz around with a few nips here and there. No, 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 no. We're dealing with an unstable system in the fullest sense of that term. And if masses of people say, we've had it with this, it's over. The Soviet Union did not collapse in 1989 because the United States attacked it militarily. It collapsed because in its society, the mass of people who had at least as much reason as all of you do to believe that that government was all powerful, all seeing, a surveillance state, all the things that we know about. The people said, hey, we can't stand it anymore. We don't believe it, we don't support it, we're not gonna continue with a complicity as if it were invulnerable. And guess what? It turned out not to be invulnerable. When finally it happens here, that's what we'll understand too. But it would be a lot better if you got the idea beforehand. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the way we run this, we'll take, I did ask you, you want to take 3 or
Anyway, you do it anyway.
Okay, so given the size of the grouping and the experience that we've had in sort of we're going to take 3 questions. We'll hear them. Sometimes it'll provide a synthesis. Rick will be able to provide a synthesis. Sometimes we'll have to hit on each one. We ask you to limit your comments or questions to 2 minutes. That'll enable as much conversation as possible. And I'll also call on people who haven't yet spoken, call on them before the people who thought of another thing they'd like to ask or say. Okay, so I'm going to go down this row and then down that way. 1, 2, and then 3. Okay, so.
Good afternoon, Rick. Thanks for coming out and taking the time. I really appreciate it. I want to pick up on your very last point. Having one that's been worked at the KPFK in Los Angeles and recording a lot of these lectures and been at them, I want to pick up your very last point. Because hearing these tales of woes and everything that comes down, there are well-meaning and erudite people, well-read, that will get up at these events and say, capitalism isn't working. When the point of the fact is, it is working. And the thing is, it comes right even down into our current politics, in terms of what's happening now, in terms of the election, and in terms of, and I'm going to offend some people here, having to do with popular political figures, namely Bernie Sanders, Jill Stein, and Shama Sawant. They want to reform capitalism, and they keep putting that in different ways and doing it in different ways, but it's the same thing. How do we get to a point where we can get people to say it is time to throw off capitalism?
So you're going to take 3.
Yeah,
Do you
3.
remember that? Okay. Then the second was somebody in here, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Peter. Thank you very much, Rick.
You'll have to speak up, so
My name is
other...
Peter. Thank you very much, Rick. I agree with everything you said. One thing I do disagree with, and I think we're going to get to that, is I heard we're going to offer solutions instead of just talking about the problem. So you talked about the problem. I'm on my second go-round of, in the last month, of reading Robert Reich's Saving Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few. A lot of the same ideas introduced, and he talks about the 5 building blocks of capitalism. My idea, and if you could talk about a little bit, is one of them is enforcement. So to take one further from him, I would say enforcement without deterrent is not enforcement. So you brought up New Deal. How do we bring back the New Deal? How do we get the antitrust to come back? How do we break up the cyclical, great wealth for the great many, which buys political power, which gets us to the point where we're considered corporations people?
Okay, and then 3. Yes.
Hi, Richard. Thank you again for all of it that you do. And Karen Lee Wolff, we met in San Jose with Richard Hobbs, the junior attendant.
Right.
That up higher?
No, it's fine.
Richard was going to be here today, but he's got the flu, so he asked me to ask his question. One of the things that we asked you about after your talk in San Jose was about looking at what Cuba is doing now to try to have a viable socialism with cooperatives, workers' cooperatives. And you hadn't looked at that yet, but you said your group was going to Cuba. And so the question is, have they yet gone? Can you now speak about whether the form of workers' cooperatives that they're developing seems like one of the alternatives that we should be looking at? And also for Richard, I was supposed to bring flyers, but I forgot, but Human Agenda and Richard are having a group going to look at cooperatives in Cuba in January, so since I forgot the flyers, if anybody wants to ask me about it afterwards, you can.
Okay, there's your three.
Okay, let me try heroically and briefly. They're all very good issues and questions. For a long time, it has been the limit of left-wing politics to reform, improve, fix capitalism, because it was believed by most of the people who were able and willing to be critical of capitalism that that was as far as one could legitimately go. That if one went beyond fixing it, saving it, even saving it from itself, which is what Robert Reich said, and even Hillary Clinton at one point early in her debate said that sometimes you have to save capitalism from itself, and positioning herself as doing that. That has been the notion that that's the limit. If you go beyond that, people stop listening, then you are crazy or a kook or something worse than that, an evil communist from God knows where. And so you couldn't. You didn't want to lose your audience. So the limit of how far you could go was this reformism, whatever word you want to put. And I wouldn't be so harsh, maybe, as some of you, about understanding the limits of political possibility in the United States in terms of even a dream of a large or mass audience. You dare not go beyond that. Well, why was that? Well, that goes to the second point. At the end, in the Great Depression, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, I do this on the radio periodically, you've heard me, but very quickly. In the depths of the Great Depression, the American people acted differently from the way they've acted since 2008. They were angry and they were determined to fix and change things. You had an enormous communist party, you had two very large, well-organized socialist party, and you had the greatest upsurge of labor movement mobilization that the country has ever seen. Never had anything like it before, we've never had anything like it since. You have to go back and read about it now to even get a feeling for what it was like. But it was very successful. Tens of millions of people identified either with the communists or the socialists or the labor movement or all of them. And they worked very well together despite all their disagreements. Well, that produced the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt was a middle-of-the-road Democrat. He wasn't even a left-wing Democrat. It was nothing when he ran for office. He became what he later became because he responded to something from below. Why is that important? Because after the war, that was understood by the business and right-wing community of the United States. They understood real well that the problem wasn't the Democratic Party and the problem wasn't Franklin Roosevelt. The problem was the movement from below. And they went to work to destroy that. They figured out what the weak link was. It was the Communist Party, which could be portrayed not as the militant leader of organization efforts, which it mostly was in the 30s, but instead as an arm of a foreign power. That was a wonderful way to kill them off. You did that. Then when that was done, when you got rid of them, then you went after the socialists. And you taught the American people, it's very important, you taught the American people that socialists are exactly the same as communists, they just spell it differently. No, seriously, this is very serious. That's why to this day, I, as a teacher running around the United States, and I give lots of talks in Europe too, if you give a talk in Europe and you explain something as the difference between socialists and communists, everybody in the audience understands that. They grew up with it. They know what to do. In the United States, for American, my audience is America, socialist, Marxist, communist, anarchist, they're all synonyms. It's all the same. Well, Americans aren't stupid. That has to be explained. Why would Americans think they're all the same, because that was the program after World War II. It's all the same, and the labor movement is the same thing too. And if you go to large parts of America today, liberal is the same thing too. It's all one mass of ugh. Who cares? That's very, very important, because what it did is it taught the lesson that to be against capitalism as a system is to be the bad, to be the evil, to be the beyond words. We're just, as a nation, we're just emerging from this cocoon, this horrible period. It's half a century that was going on. From the late 40s to almost now, that's more than half a century. Nothing that a country goes through for half a century dissolves overnight. That's deeply embedded, unconscious for many Americans. Back away. They hear that there's a left-wing organization that's against capitalism. That's a whole nother kettle of fish for them to get over, as opposed to, we want to fix it, we want to make it better. And however you disguise the language, people aren't stupid. They get these alternatives, and they're going to have to find their way. Having said all that, let me assure you, and I know this as well or better than most of you, simply because of where the United States is now. I travel all over the United States. I have half a dozen speeches in this area, and I go to Florida next week, on and on and on. Florida, Sarasota, Tampa, and St. Petersburg. Huge audiences. I can tell you, we can now do what our forebears have been afraid to do, without denouncing them. It's not necessary. They did what they could do in the conditions they faced. We don't face those conditions. Something has changed in the United States, so that being against the system, now is the time. It has to be done now, because I don't know how long this window will be open, and I don't know how far they'll let us get. But now is the time precisely to be, you want to give people an alternative to fix it? Then you be it. You give them that alternative. You say, yeah, we respect those of you who want to fix it. It's good instinct. You're our brothers and sisters because you recognize something is badly broken. But now give us the same respect. Our judgment is, this isn't fixable anymore. We need a new one. This is not another fix-it job. Okay, last point on the question about Cuba. In my humble opinion, and it's nothing about me is really humble, but one says that, so I say it too. In my humble opinion, the solution, if one can dare talk like that, the solution has to involve something that our forebears, who taught us a lot, didn't see. And that's not disrespectful, because every generation sees things the people ahead of them didn't. It's the way life is. So I see something. I see that the past experiments with socialism, the Soviet, the Chinese, the Cuban, and so on, were very focused on the big picture. Who owned the means of production, private or state? Whether the economy was planned by a central authority or left anarchic. They focused on those problems, and those are real problems and important problems. But they didn't focus on the organization of the workplace. They pretty much left that. They got rid of the private capitalists, but they brought in the government officials, who did pretty much the same thing. So for me, the solution is, let's correct that mistake. Let's focus ourselves now, not just on the planning and on the collective ownership, important as those are, but let's really address what wasn't addressed before, the radical transformation of the workplace, so that the people who work in a store, a factory, or an office together democratically decide what goes on there. That we don't have capitalists and shareholders and boards of directors. That's over. That's ancient history. That's done. That structure has got us to the mess we're in. That's the core of capitalism at the base where it is founded. If we can change that, then we can make the planning and the other things both democratic and effective. And that's why the focus on worker co-ops, which comes out of everything I do, is important, and why the experiment in Cuba is so important. Because there is a government that did the old kind of socialism, following the model of the Soviet Union for a long time, from 1959 until 2 or 3 years ago, to be honest, but decided in the last few years that this reliance on state enterprise, the way it was set up, is not a viable, successful way to move forward. And so they are taking major steps, which is why people are going there, to change over, to privatize the economy, not the way the New York Times would like to have us believe it, but to get away from the state enterprise in favor of cooperative enterprise. Private in the sense that it's not the state anymore, it's collectives of individuals at the base who are being given the enterprises to run in a cooperative way. I don't know, and no one else does either, whether this will succeed in Cuba. It's at an early stage. The support of the government has been pretty good until now, but one doesn't know, because, of course, the more power and strength these worker co-ops get, the greater the challenge they will give to the central government. That will have to be worked out. I don't know how that's going to happen, but it's a sign in the wind of where things are going. And for those of you that are interested, there are experiments elsewhere, not in formerly socialist countries, but in capitalist countries. The whole region of Italy, called Emilia-Romagna, if you know that part of Italy, that has the largest concentration of worker co-ops of any place in Western Europe. You want to see how an economy in which worker co-ops are like 30 to 40% of the stores and factories, there it is. It's not Mondragon, which is a very important example in Spain, but it's really more Emilia-Romagna because it's not one company, it's an enormous range of companies who work very well together, who support each other, etc. So I think that's why the Cuban experiment is so important, because it's part of a wave that is looking towards that transformation at the level of the enterprise as where things go next.
Okay, we're going to sweep down this side and then come back to that side. So let's see the hands. 1, 2, okay, we're going to jump over there then. 3. First.
I have 2 questions, and I'm going to address either one. I appreciate it. One, I'm interested in public transit workers and public sector who will not be privatized or non-governmentalized, whatever. And the expansion of, like if we had a world-class public transit systems, then we'd say triple the number of people employed and all the implications that for employment. And if you could speak about that. And then the other thing is intellect workers. I was a member of the Graduate Students Union at Cal, which is UAW. UAW, that local, UAW local 2865, is the biggest UAW local west of the Mississippi. Now, I'm hoping that that perhaps brief experience that people have as union members of the UAW will make them want to stay union members and use their intellects and demand that they have the opportunity to use their intellects to ask useful questions. I'm also now currently a member of another UAW local, UAW 1981, which is the National Writers Union. And I'm hoping that we're going to start focusing a relationship between the two. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you to comment if there's the things worth talking about.
And then, where'd that guy go? To the back. Yeah. Well, somebody had their hand up there. They're buried in the
Yes,
sea
about
of
3 months
heads.
ago, Jill Stein, an avowed socialist, spoke in San Francisco, and at the end I asked her, I said, what can we do about, how can we get rid of the most destructive force in the history of the U.S., billionaire class? Her answer was, tax the hell out of the rich. Now, my question is, did Bernie Sanders, is Bernie Sanders good for the cause of socialism?
Okay, and then we have the third
Yeah,
here.
Charles, one of the editors for Class Warrior. I think the Marxist view of the origin of crisis is slightly different than the one you present. If we look at volume 3, chapters 13 and 14, you know where I'm going.
Yes.
About the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. And most recently elaborated by Michael Roberts in his book, The Long Depression. I think we have two different views in the socialist movement about the origin of crisis. So we also see that one of the major commodities produced by capitalism is capital itself. And Marx's understanding is that this capital becomes highly accumulated in the hands of the capitalists who cannot invest it profitably. In other words, it's harder and harder to make a dime on a dollar. So they're unable to invest. So I just think you kind of put the cart before the horse, putting it all in the origin of crisis in productive realm. So with this overproduction of capital, capitalism stagnates, and we have these crises and the collapse. It might seem, like, oh, we're just like, bickering over heads of the pin or whatever it is, but I think it ends up with a different approach for how we go about ending capitalism and this crisis forever. Because if we can find the solution in underconsumption, then we can maybe tax the billionaires by half, pass out all the money, and everybody can buy what's needed, as opposed to overthrowing capitalism by expropriating the capitalist class, which takes a revolutionary party, and it takes a revolutionary movement that has a program that puts on its agenda a workers' party that fights for a workers' government that expropriates the capitalist class by the workers themselves. So I think that's a discussion I'm sure you're familiar with. Goes on all over.
Okay. Transit Workers Union. It's hard for me not to get into a conversation about transit. It is one of those areas of our economy where the irrationality of what we have is mind-blowing. The wind is also blowing. Think about it with me for a minute. The automobile is the largest polluter of our air. The automobile uses in vast amounts of fossil fuel, which we all know what that's about. It causes more death and injury than anything else in the accidents that we all have. It is lunacy as a way of moving people around, even if it didn't have all those other qualities. So the only rational way to do this would be to have mass transit in all the urban and suburban areas, and then at the edges of all of the cities you'd have what you already have, which is depots where people who need a car for something can go and get one. We call that Hertz and Avis and all that, but that could be done rationally for everybody, and then we wouldn't have any of this craziness. It is wasteful beyond all words, etc., etc. We haven't solved that problem because we can't do that without challenging a capitalist system that has become dependent over time on everything having to do with the automobile. That's where we locate. Suburbia is a creature of the automobile, allowing you to get from the rural excess into the urban area, unless it were, transformed by public transportation. We have industries that are dependent on it, our major oil industries, our major car industry, plastic industry, chemical industry. It would take a radical alteration of the whole structure to solve this problem. Capitalism left to itself cannot solve the problem. You can see the height of this, that the solution now with new technology is to produce a self-driving individual car. Where even when you have the new technology, they still don't want to understand what a collective solution might look like, which would have to do with public transportation. Well, why is that? Again, I don't have enough time, but a little math example, which I did on the radio the other day, which some of you may have listened to, but I can do it very quickly again. Imagine a capitalist who sells something, doesn't matter what it is, and has a workforce to make it. And then along comes a new technological innovation, a new machine. And with this new machine, you need 10% less labor than before to produce the same cars. So the capitalist can produce the same cars or whatever it is, earn the same money, sell it at the same price, but keep a bigger profit for himself if he fires 10% of the workers. It's simple. And most capitalists, faced with this situation, would fire 10% of the workers. But of course, there's an alternative. If you need 10% fewer people to produce the same cars at the same revenue for the capitalist, what you could do is give everybody 10% less work per week to do. That would solve your problem. Everybody's work week goes from 40 hours to 36 hours. After lunch on Friday, everybody goes home. The exact same number of goods will be produced at the same price, the same revenue flow to the capitalist, who can keep the same as he did before, same profit, and give the workers exactly what he gave them before. And the benefit is to the workers, they all get 4 hours of free time. Same wage. You understand the economics? Crystal clear, not a problem at all. Never happens in capitalism. Because the benefit of technology in capitalism goes to make more profits. It does not go to what innovators often say, hoping to save on human labor. Yeah, you hope, but you'll never get it. And the problem isn't technology, the problem is capitalism. You have allowed the decision of how to take the benefits of technological change and put them in the service of capitalism. That's why 10% of workers will get no jobs, suffering craziness, and all the benefit of the technological breakthrough accrues to the higher profits of the capitalists. Undemocratic, unfair, and unnecessary. In a rational system, you'd never do that. The very least a rational system would do would give some to the capitalists and some to the workers. We don't do that. That's why workers don't want technical change, because it has always been at their expense to the benefit of profit. Capitalists love to say, "Ooh, we're in favor of progress and the workers want to hold back." Of course they want to hold back, because you've used it against them for 500 years. It's craziness. The whole issue of transportation ought to be in the forefront of a movement by workers, not only to make it a collective, cooperative enterprise that serves the customer, the mass of people who use it, and that who could share in the governance. Consumers and workers in the governance don't need private enterprise. But if the workers did that, they would then not only be pushing for their own immediate benefit, they'd be part of a social movement to radically alter the whole nature of transportation. If there's a future for unionized transport, that's it. They don't have a future otherwise, because if they were successful, then you'd see the movement to rationalize just to save on having to pay them the wages they were strong enough to get. Second thing. My notes just blew away. Bernie. I'm grateful to Bernie Sanders. What can I tell you? I haven't the slightest problem telling you that. This is a person who came along at the right time and said to the American people, I'm a socialist. I'm not going to run away from the label. Get used to it. There were demonstrations in New York City years ago of queer people who said, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. And New York City did. No one had the courage quite to do that before them. They did. It was the right time. It happened. He's made it possible to be a socialist. For half a century, that was an instantaneous, you're out of commission. It was political suicide. He did it. And he gets the credit for that. Whatever you like or don't like about his particular policies before or after, what he's doing now with supporting Hillary around the country and all that, I understand the questions and disappointments, but this was an important chapter in getting back to a United States so it could be like all the other countries of Europe, for example, where debates between socialists and communists and others are a normal part of everybody's life. For years, my family's partly French. For years, I would go back to France. I'd turn on the television on Sunday, and I would see the equivalent of Meet the Press and those other kinds of programs. And one week, there would be the head of the Communist Party, the next week, the head of the Anarchist Party, the next week, a Nazi. And people had a sense of they had a sense of the range of opinion, which reflected France a hell of a lot better than the anemic, sanitized version of what we get in this. And what was the last question again? Just remind me.
Falling rate of profit.
Oh, yes, the falling rate of profit. Absolutely. Look, in Marx's Capital, which, for most of my adult life, I was a teacher who taught volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Capital. I learned I'm in debt always to that, which is why if I get asked the question, are you a Marxist economist, I say, of course. And I'm not going to run away from that. It taught me too much. But having said that, Marxists many of you have probably noticed this, they don't agree on everything amongst themselves. And they never have, and that's okay, because every major historical school of thought has people who disagree. So there are people who think, for example, as you correctly pointed out, that the major way to understand crisis is through overproduction, underconsumption, and all of that. And another school that thinks the best way to understand it is a long-term tendency for the rate of profit to fall, which is independent of these crisis ups and downs, and so on. The way I read Capital, and that's just one way to do it, it's not the only way. The way I read it is that Marx was trying to get at different ways that this capitalist system is self-destructive. He was, in a way, cataloging and examining the different contradictions. There aren't just overproduction, underconsumption, and falling rate. There are others. In Volume 2 of Capital, at the beginning, is a wonderful formula which shows how capitalists have to accomplish the exchange of goods in a certain way for the system to work. And then they have to manage production in a certain way. And then they have to sell the output. That's why I did a little story with Walmart and so on. That there are lots of ways that this system is fragile and can break down. So I understand others, but I don't find it useful to have debates about the one or the other. All of them are going on. Which one bubbles up to the surface at any given moment depends on all the conditions of time and place. But I wouldn't privilege the one relative to the other. Either way, these are different ways that this system breaks itself down. The key point is that it's fragile, vulnerable, and breaks down with a lot of different mechanisms, and that the more we understand that, the more courage we'll have to intervene wherever the contradictions are and to see the change in system that's possible if we do that.
I'm going to give a 15-minute warning. We usually give a 10-minute warning, but given sort of our situation, so we'll start at the back and move forward. One,
She's got loads of people here.
2, 3, I see another hand. Okay, and then we'll get to this side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, got that? So quickly, we'll take 4 this time.
Okay, real fast. So I'm wondering if you could clarify a little bit this question of socialized production and a real socialist society, because a socialist society, yes, there will be cooperative enterprises, but it's on the scale of the world. We're not looking for an island of cooperatives. That would be radically insufficient. And then number 2, a collectivized workplace under capitalism isn't necessarily a means to an end. It's one thing to collectivize a small shop, it's another thing to collectivize perhaps a even larger shop. It's another thing to collectivize Chevron, to collectivize the oil industries, to collectivize the train. That's a declaration of civil war, and it's not a means, it's a revolution that's going to take the revolutionary seizure of power in order to carry out the cooperatives that you're talking about. So I'm wondering if you can just clarify that aspect.
Okay, next one quickly. Whoever, yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on the nature of money, particularly since the subprime mortgage crisis. I see younger people who don't like cash, don't even want to look at coins. They believe in credit cards, debit cards, digitalized money, Bitcoin. What is money at this point in our world, and how does that contribute to the instability?
What happened to number 3? Okay, we're jumping over 3, so you're, okay. You, him, and then you first. Quickly though.
Yes, actually, some opponents of capitalism, we say that, I think we made a mistake saying that, the laissez-faire neoliberal capitalists, they say like the government out of the economy, and actually they go for the government to intervene, helping privatize resources, to deregulate, and to enforce a new government intervention favoring the capitalist class. As you know this treaty that was written in the early 90s, the reinvention of government, became the Bible of the new liberals. And actually, one example within the realms of the American empire about governmental intervention in an economy through, in this case, through imperialism, is how the imperialist government of the United States intervenes in the economy now of Puerto Rico, actually, demanding that the government, that, placing this board in place, and, yesterday, they publicized that they put 5 public corporations under the control of this so-called board. So that's one way that they use the government to enforce the hegemony and the dictatorship of private capital. So I want to end up by saying thank you for the Revolutionary Workers Group for putting this conference, and thank you, Dr. Wolff, for coming here.
Yeah.
This is a very non-theoretical, empirical question. You came up with Walmart as the quintessential merchant playing that role, and I thought you were going to say Amazon, and I have no idea where Amazon is. It got the same potential, but it's just much smaller right now, or what? As I order everything through Amazon.
So we'll do those 4, then hopefully have time for 1 or 2 more, probably maybe 1 more, because we have to end at 3:30.
This question always arises sooner or later. A very good question. This notion of having worker co-ops leaves you with risks. But before I respond, let me remind you, if anyone in this room has a strategy for how we get forward that has no risks, where have you been all my life? I'd be the first one to sign up for your, we have risks. Is it possible for co-ops to become just a small kind of enclave, a kind of footnote to a larger capitalist system? The answer is, of course that's a risk. And the reason I know that is that's the case in the United States, for example, and in many other countries. We've had worker co-ops in the United States for a century or longer. If you ever want to see a really successful one, many of you know the Shakers, an early religious community here in the United States, which is still going in Western Massachusetts. Shakers, you all with me? They make that furniture that some of you know, beautiful handmade furniture. They were Shakers because their particular version of Protestantism required, this is going to perk up some of you for sure, required of them to abstain from sexual connections. And they substituted shaking. They relieved whatever tensions may arise in anybody who cannot engage in that activity by shaking themselves in kind of fits of religious fervor that were a substitute. Hence, they were called the Shakers, and they were looked upon by other people as strange. But they made an interesting decision, and the decision was that they would not only be a Protestant sect in early colonial America, but that they would offer a place for women seeking to escape abusive relationships to find a home. And they have lasted ever since because that was a genius way to solve the problem of their growth, given that they couldn't solve it in the usual way. So women, starting in early colonial times, would run away from an abusive husband with children in tow, and they always knew they could go to a Shaker community which, without any question, without any moral condemnation, you're talking about Puritan America here, would take them in, give them a job, take care of their children, feed them, and find a place for them in their community. It's a remarkable story. They organized all their production as worker co-ops. A radically democratic place in which the women had the same amount of power as the men, another unusual quality. The fact that women were the majority, given what they were doing, which the men supported, et cetera, remarkable. Okay, so we know there have been co-ops in the United States. They're just one of many examples. Well, what happened was, After World War II, when the crunch came down on the socialists and communists and the labor movement, the co-op movement in this country, which is large, was large then, is large now, decided, whoa, we better step away from anything that smacks of socialism, communism, collective activity. Not an easy task for a worker co-op, since that's what they are. So they cleaned up their act, to make a long story short. They presented themselves as a lovely, warm, cuddly kind of sideshow to American capitalism, where lovely people, particularly in rural areas, would get together and like they made quilts in a group, they would have a little worker co-op, but nobody should think it's about social change or a social movement or it has anything to do with anti-capitalism. And so they were able to survive the Cold War. That's why they're still here. There's a United States Federation of Worker Co-ops. You want to understand that history? Just go to the website, you'll see it. It's all there. On the one hand, they are very excited when people like me, coming from the left, say, you're way more than an interesting, cuddly experiment. You are the future of an anti-capitalist transformation. They get very excited, and 10 minutes later they go, uh-oh, now we're going to get the kind of attention we don't want. And they're fighting that out. They're struggling with those two tendencies. As to the question, I don't know how the revolution is going to come. None of us do, right? I mean, a few clairvoyants amongst us, but the rest, we don't. So we make worker co-ops because it is a way to get people excited about a new system, a new energy, a new way of organizing production. And we hope, and we will work at, making bindings among them, helping each other grow. And imagine with me for a moment what it might mean to have a worker co-op sector of the United States, which began to understand that it was desperately in need of changes at the government level to enable worker co-ops. Changes like providing them with the legal capacity to function. Changes like providing them with low or below market interest rates to acquire the capital to enable this to continue. With all kinds of rules about curriculums in schools, teaching people what collective decision-making was rather than staying in line. Imagine a worker co-op sector that provided a political party with the financial resources to function, and a political party that understood its role as the support of an alternative economic sector to capitalism. Imagine what that would be in terms of transforming the political landscape, the ideological landscape. Come on, that's where we're going. Will it be enough? I don't know. Can it be deflected into reformist avenues? Anything we do can have that happen to it. Guarantees in advance, they're not available. They never were. But if we have clear in our minds what our goal is and we push in that direction, this is an avenue, I think, very, very potentially powerful. And it is, I can tell you from my own activity, you run around the country and you talk to people about transforming capitalism in a way that they can understand in terms of their own factory or office or store being run in a radically different way that involves them in a daily transformed life. They can understand that a lot better than the old tradition of socialism about something that happens far away by some benevolent government, even if it's led by a popular leader. Yeah, I never take seriously the right wing. I have to deal with them all the time. When they talk to me, when they start talking about laissez-faire, that's a fantasy. The government has been central to the survival of capitalism from day one. The capitalists captured the government and used it to smash the feudalism that was left and standing in their way. And they have used it to support themselves at every turn. In the tax laws, the subsidy laws, the school curricula, there is no area of social life that capitalists have not made use of the government to solve the problems they could not. We live in the United States. In the autumn of 2008, this country came that close to complete collapse. the city of New York, the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, which where everything happened, was this close to declaring we don't know what to do anymore. Everything has collapsed. And the bankers of this country get used to giving speeches every 30 days about the government is inefficient, the government is no good, all got on their private jets, went to Washington, D.C. to beg the government to save them, which it did. To hear these people now resume I'll use a technical term, bullshit about the government not being essential is hysterically funny, but not to be taken seriously. Of course, the government has always been called in. You had, pick your example. For 50 years, you've had a very cozy relationship. And I'm going to be blunt here. I don't mean to pick on the Puerto Rican government because it's no different from the government in Illinois or any place else, but let's use it. A very cozy relationship between the leading politicians in Puerto Rico and the bankers in New York. The bankers in New York gave them loans. With loans, they could buy their political support and power. They even gave a little bit to the mass of people in low electric rates and a few other things. Very cozy. They taxed the mass of people. They used the money from Puerto Rico to pay off the loans. They paid the fees. The banks made a fortune. These politicians kept the lid on the whole situation. And it was such a fun time that they never looked at the limits until they got to $72 billion and discovered there's no way on earth we can ever pay this off. They even had Mr. Padilla get up on the television. There's no way we can pay this off. The same man who arranged them throughout his political career is announcing, hey, I just figured it out. We can't pay. It's like the governor of Illinois announcing he can't pay either, which he can't. Illinois is just bad shape as Puerto Rico. So what do they do now? They do the same thing. The government comes in, takes over, saves the whole situation, taxes the crap out of the people of Puerto Rico. I mean, Puerto Rico is the poorest place in this country. They just lowered the minimum wage in that country, lowered it to about $4 and something the last I looked. And they already have the highest sales. It's the poorest part of America, lowers the minimum wage and has a sales tax, I believe, 11.5% today. I mean, you can't make this stuff up because it would appear to be too extreme. It isn't. It's the government solving the problem on the backs of the mass of people now that the very profitable, cozy relationship between New York banks and the leading politicians over there has been exploded. But by the way, there are signs of fighting. The Kentucky, a little town, Fort White in northern Kentucky, sued the Kentucky retirement system, the Kentucky government, for misspending and misappropriating and misinvesting all the retirees' money. 350,000 retired school teachers and firefighters and police people in Kentucky have no money for their pensions. And they allowed for the first time a town to sue the state for misappropriation. That's already a sign that the coming crisis, which if I had time I would talk to you about, which is, and I don't mean to scare you, but on the other hand, I have to. If you think you have a pension, worry about it, because you don't. The money isn't there, and they're not going to give it to you either. What form this will take, nobody knows. But the chaos, that there is no money for most of the pensions that are set up in this country, particularly by public authorities. And everyone is waiting for some magic to happen to solve this problem. There is no solution to this problem.